has the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Benita. Always a pleasure to see you again. The other side of the Atlantic, or this one. Thank you, Mr. Cremades, for hosting us. Thank you, Javier, for another brilliant presentation. I can subscribe to everything you said. I'm an active diplomat, and I just arrived from New York, so I have these two limitations: jet lag and trying to protect my job. So the things I can say, I'm more limited in my freedom of expression than the previous speakers. But I'll try to be very frank with you. And my first point is to say that I'm also an optimist. I think that, first of all, the world is in a much better place today than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or 70 years ago. And we should not forget that. And those who criticize globalization, those who criticize the openness of societies and markets should bear that in mind. And some of the figures that both Javier Solana and Enrique Iglesias have mentioned are a clear illustration of that. So let's not be gloomy, let's not be catastrophic, but let's at the same time recognize that we have a few problems that we need to deal with, and I deal with them every day in New York. And I would like us not to forget that. Let me start by commenting or prolonging a little bit some of the things that both Javier Solana and Enrique Iglesias have said. On Javier's point, or some of the points, just a complement of information to reinforce his comments. On the G20 story. The G20 Leaders Process, there was a G20 Finance Minister process before. I was involved, I think we can already start talking about these things, but the moment the G20 was born as a leaders process was in a meeting in Camp David, which is the outside of Washington residence of the President of the United States. Mr. Trump doesn't go there because there's no golf course in it. So, but Mr. Bush at the time, George W. Bush, was there very often. So I was accompanying President Barroso together with President Sarkozy to Camp David, and this was right after the election of President Obama. But President Obama was not yet in office, so we're talking about November 2008. And our purpose was to convince President Bush to agree, and eventually to call a summit to deal with the financial crisis. And the meeting started with Mr. Bush, very much aware of the problems, but basically saying, I don't think we need a summit. A summit will only create more problem, more tension, and complicate things rather. So on our side, I mean, my boss and Sarkozy, their point was to convince Bush to do that, which they eventually did. And the second question was, what kind of summit? Are we going to do a G7 enlarged to whom? And we were very much on the side of a G20, exactly for the reasons that Javier Solana mentioned. So just a point for historic purpose, it was, we have a G20 today because we push forward to it. The first meeting of the G20 took place in Washington at that point in time, and then followed by London, Pittsburgh, and further on. So I think it's important in terms of the role of the European Union in global governance, in making sure that global governance is inclusive and is effective. I think this is a good illustration of the points made by Javier. On another point you made, which is very important, the IMF votes, the relative weight of world powers in the most important economic/financial organization of the world. Javier Solana, as always, is absolutely right. The weight of China was ridiculously low compared to the weight of China in the real economy. And you cannot ask the Chinese to apply the rules, which they did not design. They were not involved in the Bretton Woods. And at the same time, to add insult to injury, give them a ridiculous say in the international body. So we had to change that situation. And one of the exercises, and I was a G20 Sherpa doing all these summits as well, round tables like this, finding an agreement to give more weight to, which we eventually did, and we sacrificed our own votes in the IMF in favor of China. Now, what happened? We all agreed on that, including the Americans. The US Congress took 8 years to approve that. It's only 1 year ago, 1.5 years ago, I don't know exactly, but at least 8 to 9 years for the US Congress to agree something that we had decided in, I think, London or Pittsburgh in 2009. So this gives you an idea. We gave up our votes, but even then, the Americans took a long time to recognize that they had to give an extra say, an extra capacity to influence decisions of IMF to the Chinese. My third point, which Javier Solana did not elaborate too much because he didn't have time, but I want to make a point about it, and I link it to the Congress of the Communist Party, is, and we discussed this in New York a few weeks ago, which is, and I don't want to elaborate because this is an area which is sensitive as, for an active ambassador, but pay attention to the role China, the growing role China is playing, not in the economy, we all know about that, but in world governance, in multilateral systems, and the capacity of the Chinese to impose, or at least to present a very attractive narrative that basically says we can have development without human rights. We can have development without a real democracy. So there is an alternative to the Western liberal model. We need to pay attention to this because this is one of the issues that we'll have to address. My fourth point has to do with what Mr. Iglesias said about the Atlantic and the Pacific. If I'm not quoted, I would say that the battle of the Pacific, we have to win it first in the Atlantic. So we, Europeans, but for that matter also Latin Americans, we cannot place ourselves in the right position to address whatever will happen in the Pacific, and we know the Pacific will be the center of the world, if not already, in a very near future, if we don't have the Atlantic as a solid basis. And I see here an untapped potential. We are not using the Atlantic as much as we can. So I'm and I was involved in Washington in reflections along the lines that you mentioned, bringing together these 4 blocks of the Atlantic. North America, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Africa is the continent of the future. They have a long Atlantic coast. Some of it speaks Portuguese, by the way. Some of it speaks Spanish a little bit as well. Not much, but okay. It's a good balance. Let's try to work more on this. And one of my points when I talk about Latin America has to do with that. So just these comments on two very interesting first interventions. So where are we today? Javier Solana is absolutely right. I want to repeat what he said. My way of synthesizing is that we're living through times of transition and disruption. We have seen worse times in the history in terms of security threats and all that. But I don't think we have seen many occasions like the one we have today in which we have such a degree of transition and such a level of disruption in our systems. And this is good and bad, of course. Times of change are opportunities to do interesting things, to make business, to make money. But if we don't manage the transition well, and if we don't address the disruption well, they can be very damaging. They can be dangerous times. And I think this is this kind of awareness that I wanted, from my observation point in New York, to bring to you. And today, I think the question for, let's say, the Western world, and we all represent the West here, is a very simple one. Is basically, do we want at least to try to determine our future, or are we ready to accept that others will decide for us? It's a simplistic, maybe, way of putting it, but I think it focused the minds of people on what is essential. Do we want to do that or not? One of my jobs in Washington prior to New York was to try to develop a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, TTIP. Our basic idea, and I worked a lot with someone in the White House on this, our starting point was we still have a certain comparative advantage in the world. But this is not going to stay with us for long. So this is maybe the opportunity, time-wise, historic-wise, for us to still influence the next stage. But if we don't do it now, and by now we were talking, this was 2010, 11, 12, we have about 10 years to do that. In 10 years' time, it will be more difficult. In 20 years' time, it may be too late. And TTIP was basic idea was, let's try to bring together the two most important economies in the world, if you take the EU as a single economy, and let's try to determine and influence the way things will develop. Let's try to decide the size of the batteries for the electric cars of the future. Because if we don't do that with the advantage that we have today, others will do with the advantage of the size of their markets, with which we cannot compete. We cannot compete with 1 billion people, 1 point whatever in India, and the increase. So seize the moment and the opportunity that we have together to do that. And I think this is valid for EU and Latin America, from all points of view. I like to call this relationship the best kept secret. Because there is so much potential in it, and so unused potential in it, that we can only do better. We can only do better in a number of areas. And I think it's time for us to rise to the occasion. Europeans, Latin Americans, Ibero-Americans leading this process. And I think of 4 or 5 areas in which we could do that. First is trade. I mean, let's complete Mercosur. Let's upgrade other agreements. Let's sophisticate further our trade relationship. I think we have to move away from relatively first, second generation trade agreements to higher up, to more sophisticated ones. Some of the elements that we developed for TTIP, or which are now in CETA, our agreement with Canada, can very usefully be adapted to agreements with Latin America. Let's talk about regulatory issues. Let's talk about the economic reform to increase competitiveness of our economy. So let's upgrade these agreements. Let's complete them in geographic coverage, and let's upgrade them in terms of content. Second one is climate change. I go back to some things that Javier said earlier. And my conversations with my American colleagues and friends go very much in the same direction. They are shooting themselves in the foot. Even ExxonMobil, who was run until recently by the now Secretary of State, even ExxonMobil is in favor of the Paris Agreement. So something strange happened somewhere for America to consider the possibility of withdrawing from Paris. We are trying to manage that, and for the moment there are no consequences, and we hope that there will be no real consequences. But this is about the future of the world, of the planet, of our children and grandchildren. It's obvious, but it's also about the economy. And the problem in America, for instance, is that companies have already invested, planned, prepared for the green economy, and now somebody tells them, no, we're not going to that. We're going to reinstate support to fossil fuels, and we're going to withdraw subventions to new technologies. So there's a lot of confusion here, and I think the evolution in America will go in the right direction at the end of the day, also for these reasons. But I think that we can do more. Those who are in Paris in a genuine, authentic way, and that includes the Chinese. The Chinese understood better and sooner than some Americans the advantage of being in Paris. They are now the world top producers of solar panels. If we don't do TTIP, they will tell us how the size of the batteries of the electric cars. Absolutely sure about that. So Europeans and Latin Americans, let's work on that in a serious way, also from an economic point of view, let alone from an environmental one. The third one is migration. When I arrived in New York and met the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he's a very nice person. He asked me, what can I do for you? And I said, migration, migration, migration. My first task was to make sure, with Federica Mogherini and all our leaders, that migration is not a European problem. It cannot be a European problem, because it is not, and if it is, we have no solution for it.
Exactly.
It is a global reality, a global phenomenon. I don't even call it problem. Phenomenons and reality sometimes create problems, but it is not a problem. It is a reality. People are migrating around the world. And by the way, more in Africa than in Europe, and more in other parts of the world than in Europe. So it is by definition global. But there was nothing in the global governance framework to regulate that. There are conventions for refugees, but if you look attentively, there's nothing in the world today that provides a framework for the movement of people. We have regulated movement of capitals, not too well, but still, and we are improving. We have regulated the movement of goods and services within WTO and a number of other agreements. There's nothing on the other very important production factor, which is labor, mobility of people. And we have to make a clear distinction between refugees and economic migrants. So our job was to do that, and we had the New York Declaration, a process that is started. And by the way, one of the facilitators of what we call the Global Compact for Migration is my good friend and colleague, the Ambassador of Mexico. So I think this is an area in which Latin America, which is also, to some extent, countries of origin, but also countries of transit and also countries of destination, that we can do more together. The third one is security. Prolonging what was said earlier, I think the present threats to world security, from nuclear proliferation to global terrorism, non-state actors being challenging states, this is something that cannot be absent from the agenda, the Latin American European agenda. And Benita remembers very well, this was not there, hardly there up to now. There was a sort of people were afraid to discuss these kind of issues for some reason. I think we can no longer afford to be afraid of discussing security issues with our Latin American friends. From terrorism to organized crime linked to terrorism, all this is, as was said. So I think there's a potential, enormous potential here to do that. And that's where Africans come in as well. If you think of the four blocks, what we have today, organized crime from between Latin America and Africa coming to Europe, you cannot solve the problem only at the destination of the problem. You have to go beyond. And the fifth point, I guess, is the multilateral system. Well, that comes to my job today, and I see every day in New York the potential for further cooperation between us and Latin Americans, and that is not happening. On foreign policy and security in general, where we share fundamentally the same values, the same interests, there is no big difference there. On human rights, we have difficult fights in the UN right now with China, with Russia, with some African countries on human rights, on some developing countries somehow, controlled by China. We need to work with Latin America on this. And we can work because we are fundamentally on the same wavelength. And even when you have problems in Latin America, and I think of Venezuela, I mean, you see where the European Union is, what we're doing with the opposition in Venezuela. Just given them the Sakharov Prize in the European Parliament. We are on the right side of the debate always, ready to engage, and our position towards Venezuela is very much proning a dialogue and proning consultation around the problems, but with a very strong underlining of the values. So I think on multilateral system, we can do more. And if we think of Ibero-America, I mean, we have an Ibero-American Secretary General right now, coming from member state of the European Union, which I know very well, the member state, and the person as well. So I think we have a great Secretary General at the UN, a great opportunity for the Euro-American, Latin American dialogue through the United Nations also to be strengthened. So I'd like to conclude with, again, a positive and an optimist comment. I think, again, the world is going through a difficult moment, but it's also an exciting moment, a moment of opportunities where we can do things, but risks. So let's try to minimize the risks, maximize the opportunities, and let's try to do it in Spanish or Portuguese. Thank you very much.